By any measure, Nikolai Gogol is a cornerstone, not just of Russian, but of world literature. Lauded by his contemporaries as the first Russian realist, an inspiration for the likes of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, he was also a founding father of the modern absurd tradition, a humorist, a depressive, a trickster, and a religious fanatic rolled into one. He followed his greatest literary success, 1842's Dead Souls, with a 10-year creative silence that ended in a final descent into illness, madness, and death. The film adaptations of his works alone span a century, from the earliest days of animation to contemporary CGI-strewn franchises. And their eclectic variations in style and tone speak to the endlessly malleable and uniquely strange source material that Gogol provided. Indeed, Gogol's life and career may serve as one of the starkest examples we have that classics and canonical figures are defined as much by their contradictions as by any singular essence. For one, as V itself demonstrates, this icon of Russian literature was himself Ukrainian, surely the most important of the many Ukrainians who have contributed to the history of Russian language culture. A product in this sense of the Russian imperial project, in his early career Gogol reached for inspiration back into a version of his own Ukrainian childhood that was part autobiographical, part folkloric, and part absurdist invention. Whether he was mining and mutating his heritage in faux folk stories, or fashioning an uncanny, fun hall mirror image of his adopted Russian home of St. Petersburg, Gogol maintained a remarkable idiosyncrasy. His prose is both deeply moving and ridiculous, often within the same sentence, peppered with digressions, hyperbole, meta-literary diversions, sharp social critique, ghosts, demons, and madmen. As one critic has put it, the only consistency for Gogol lies in the principle of non-consistency. As a result, Gogol has been claimed as a patron saint of literary schools as diverse as naturalism, Dadaism, social realism, and postmodernism. On the page and on screen, a story like V proves that each of these claims is as justified and as futile as the next. V was an early classic in an active writing career that lasted only a decade, and has proven one of Gogol's most adaptable and resilient prose achievements. It is one of 4 stories that make up the 1835 collection titled Mirgorod, named after a Ukrainian town close to which Gogol was born in 1809. Mirgorod was a sequel of sorts to his debut collection, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, published in 2 parts in 1831 and 32. Written under the guidance of Aleksandr Pushkin, the father of modern Russian literature, Evenings on a Farm had proved a revelation. The collection contained some of Gogol's most memorable creations, stories like St. John's Eve and The Lost Letter, and established the principles of his characteristically heady mix of humour and horror. Gogol himself would later describe Evenings on a Farm as a student exercise, though its success was clearly enough motivation for him to follow the same template for his follow-up. Both books offer a selection of reworked and reimagined Ukrainian folktales and religious parables, set in a dreamily dangerous version of the provincial countryside, populated by Cossacks, seminary students, and supernatural forces. Mirgorod was a comparative commercial failure. The critic Oleg Sinkovsky, for instance, wrote on its release that its stories had no endings, beginnings, or ideas. Nonetheless, The volume served to further cement Gogol's reputation amongst his fellow writers, and thus to seed his growing influence over the vernacular national literature that was beginning to emerge in the 1830s from under Pushkin's shadow. Gogol was lauded for borrowing from the German Romantics in order to create something with a viscerally local character. What Gogol took from the likes of Hoffmann was the realization that folk and fairy tales created room for a blend of earthy realness and imaginative fantasy. In adapting the German model to the Ukraine of his childhood, he was also responding to a growing pressure within the Russian Empire for a homegrown mythology. As Gogol was setting out on his literary career in the late 1820s, artistic nationalism was the order of the day, and the young author capitalized on his Cossack ancestry to match the zeitgeist. In letters to his family, and in voracious reading on Ukrainian folklore, he mined the collective consciousness of the countryside for raw material. Perhaps paradoxically, it was in part his engagement with this supposedly down-to-earth and folksy mythology that saw Gogol labelled a realist by his intellectual peers. Of course, the conflation and elision here between Russian and Ukrainian cultures would these days be met with stern opposition. But Gogol's works do remind us that the cultural histories of both nations, for good and ill, have been thoroughly intertwined and mutually constitutive. One of Gogol's chief inspirations was the Ukrainian puppet theatre tradition known as vertep, from which he drew motifs, plot devices and stock characters: gypsies, peasants, Cossacks, and their shrewd and calculating wives. Even his mature later works, set in the urban expanse of Petersburg, retain a hint of these folk antecedents. One could take the author out of the village, it seems, but not the village out of the author. Not that Gogol was a slave to his sources, he was far too inventive for that. In fact, he is more likely to use the expectations created by his deployment of familiar characters and situations in order to pull the narrative rug from under his audience's feet. V is a fine example. As Natalie Moyle has written, Gogol sets up a stock folktale device with a band of 3 brothers, only to quickly abandon 2 of that party to focus on the doomed travails of the hapless Choma Brut. The figure of the V itself also appears to have been a piece of Gogolian invention, despite the author's note that opens the tale insisting that the monster is a creation of the popular imagination, reproduced without alterations. If it was instead a product of Gogol's own inimitable imagination, then the monster, with its face of iron, its limbs like rooted trunks, and eyelids that droop down to the floor, has proven one of his most durable creations, as Yershov and Kropachyov's film itself attests. Gogol had a lifelong affinity for the supernatural that sat increasingly uneasily alongside his ardent Christianity. His Ukrainian stories overflow with elements of folk horror: witches in V and St. John's Eve, pig-faced and card-playing demons in The Lost Letter, and the devil himself abroad on Christmas Eve. In his Petersburg tales, this bluntly ghoulish approach is pared back into something more obtuse and uncanny. In his classic The Nose, for instance, the hero's titular organ disappears from his face and takes to the streets in a story that hovers obscurely somewhere between allegory and farce. The overcoat, meanwhile, ends with what may or may not be a visitation by the vengeful spectre of its deceased protagonist, Akaki Akakievich. As always with Gogol, The ambiguity is the point. As many critics have noted, Gogol's monstrosities and grotesqueries are deployed in service not of some clearly demarcated battle between good and evil, but rather as evidence of the compromise at the very heart of human nature. His sorcerers and disembodied noses represent something intellectually incomprehensible and irrational, but still uncannily familiar. As Gogol came more and more under the influence of strict Christian doctrine, his eye for the demonic seems to have become for him increasingly unbearable. Convinced in his later years that literature needed to serve the cause of good, he despaired at his inability to live up to that calling, burned the unfinished second part of his masterpiece Dead Souls, and shortly thereafter died, his spiritual anxieties never satisfactorily soothed by their externalization into his fiction. In the words of Julian Connolly, the God of Christian tradition is nowhere evident in the enchanted church of V. In his place stands a deity from a different realm. The range of critical responses to V in the near 2 centuries since it was written show just how irresolvable the ambiguities at the core of Gogol's best works are. Is the tale a Ukrainian rip-off of Grimm? Is it a reflection of the author's incipient spiritual crisis? Does it reproduce or parody Slavic folk traditions? Should we read it as the work of a sexual neurotic, as a Freudian parable of incestuous longing, or as a Jungian narrative of self-discovery and archetypal encounters? Or perhaps as a premonition of postmodernism's insistence on the arbitrary nature of language itself. At times, Gogol's absurdities tipped over into outright social satire directed against the Tsarist bureaucracy, which allowed the Soviets to adopt him as a hero of the little man and a chronicler of social injustice. The Overcoat was twice adapted for the screen to this end by iconic Soviet directors. In 1926 by Grigory Kazintsev and Leonid Trauberg, and in 1959 by Alexei Batalov. An animated version by Yuri Norstein, the genius behind the children's classic Hedgehog in the Fog, has been in the works since 1981, and is Russian cinema's most tantalizingly unfinished masterwork. Clearly, it is hard to pin down Gogol's essence. Perhaps this is inevitable when it comes to such shape-shifting material. Gogol's stories will often start from an anecdotal incident, careen off into myth and magic, before fading out with a Cheshire cat's grin, their secrets quite secure. With this in mind, the ending of Yershov and Kropachyov's version of V has a satisfyingly uncertain edge to it. Choma Brut's erstwhile companions, Chaliava and Tiberi, drink to his memory, all the while mocking his failure to survive the ordeal that we have just witnessed. Then, they start to ponder. Maybe the events of the narrative never happened. Maybe Choma is still alive somewhere. Maybe the women in the market are also all witches. Who knows? In any case, it's time for them to get back to work. And then the film ends, and we are left with the singularly Gogolian sensation of having to get unsteadily back to our feet. Confused, yes, but also altered.